build what you're building. The other one up there is indemnity. What should be here? No, somebody forgot to put it on. I know, the back. Don't worry.
See the previous up there. I see the previous there.
Alright.
You got it.
And indemnity, that actually means slightly different things in different legal systems. It means a different thing in Scots law from it means in English law, as a matter of fact. But and in other countries it's a little bit different too. But the net effect's the same. In insurance terms, it means that if you can prove that a certain event against which I gave you insurance has actually happened, and that you suffered loss because of it, I've got to compensate you for that loss. You don't have to prove negligence by anybody. I may well retain a right of what's called subrogation to pursue the person who actually caused the loss. Having paid you, I can look to recover my loss from somebody else. But this idea that of indemnity is actually a very significant one when we're talking to lenders and investors these days, because it's very different from the guarantee that a lawyer gives you when they examine a title. They give you a guarantee which is backed up with a professional indemnity. And the only way you get compensated out of that is if you prove that they were negligent. And that's quite difficult to do sometimes. Generally, it's quite difficult to do. So the traditional, the normal way in the UK is to rely on this PI. And typically, lenders and investors here and in Europe have been quite happy to rely on this PI system to give them comfort in the title. Now, when you go out to places in Central Europe, for example, you will find often that the compulsory level of professional indemnity cover is actually very low. In some countries, they probably don't have any at all. And the thought of pursuing somebody through the Bulgarian courts on a PI claim is not something that I would willingly contemplate. Now, this actually affects the way that lenders regard things, because they don't want to do that either. So I'll come on to that later, but that's the kind of uncertainty that, to be honest, creates an opportunity for us. In the US, a property portfolio which wasn't title insured would be quite difficult or virtually impossible to trade. And that's especially true in the residential mortgage group market. I was always surprised at the land of free enterprise how regulated things are in the US, especially in the lending industry and in the insurance industry. Far more so in the lending industry than in the UK. Much more regulated than we see here. So if you try to trade a mortgage group there is state involvement, and organisations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will make it damn near impossible for you to sell that book if it's not title insured. And it makes it difficult to do any real comparison between the US and the UK, because you've got this sort of de facto compulsory nature of the title insurance. I'd like to think that the attitudes of lenders and investors over here are beginning to shift. The more involvement we have in doing this kind of business, I'd like to think that we're moving their attitude a bit, and we're also making people at rating agencies more aware of what we do, and more willing to accept it, perhaps beginning to see it as a credit enhancement. James mentioned the difference between known and unknown risks, and I'll come on to that later. That's got a lot to do with the evolution of the two markets. But the known risk is typified the way insurance has been used in the UK and now in Europe and the rest of Europe. And the unknown risk type of cover, what we call good title insurance. The known risk stuff we call generally defective title indemnity in the UK. The unknown risk we would call good title insurance within ourselves. How did it all start? Well, the history we've got is that around about 1870, a bit earlier, there were uninsured losses in property transactions because of fraud, which couldn't be compensated for through lawyers' PI because they hadn't been careless. And in Pennsylvania, the lawyers set up a scheme to cover this sort of thing. And the understanding I have, and really will correct me here if I'm wrong, is that after a while, lawyers started using this creature they'd set up to do the backing for the title, because they were quite sensible people, and they realised that giving an opinion on title is actually quite a dangerous thing to do. It can go wrong, and it can be pretty costly. So if you've got this captive insurance set up, why not use it? And that's what they did. The other big reason for the evolution of this industry in the US was that there isn't any national land registration system there. It's at quite a local level, it's county level, and it may not be that good at the county level. So it's not like here where you've got a national land registration system, or in countries like Turkey where you've got a superb national land registration system. So these companies that were doing this insurance started keeping their own records. And the big title companies in the States more or less are the land registration system, because their records, from what I understand anyway, are probably better than the state ones. And I understand that we share information on these things. So there's a lot of cooperation on this, and that makes a lot of sense, because Fidelity will be bigger in some areas than we are, so we can use their data, and we'll do the same for them in other parts. And this insurance that they gave in the States became the standard way of doing property deals there, and it still is. You were mentioning that more or less 100% of property. You buy a house there, it's pretty well 100% sure that that title will be insured, and the title company will actually manage the process for you in a way that doesn't happen here. In the UK and elsewhere in Europe, there's never been an attempt to provide, by lawyers, providing the equivalent of this no-fault compensation. It hasn't happened. People typically still rely on the lawyer's PI for any sort of compensation. And secondly, the land registration systems have developed with a national coverage in most countries here. They may have local offices, but it's a national coverage, and you can get records from any part of that country from wherever you want. So the process that there's been less incentive for the private sector to develop an equivalent to the land registration system here. And the process in Europe generally is that lawyers examine the title thoroughly, and if they find a problem, they try and resolve it, they try and fix it. So they buy the client, or they give the lender a clean title. And what insurance was used to do, and still is used to do, is to fix the cases where the lawyer can't do that. Where you've got an access problem, and you just cannot find who owns that piece of ground. You'd be surprised in many cases in the City of London, you've got an entrance in off the street, and the little bit of road that goes in from the adopted highway crosses along the curb line, and the little bit that goes in, nobody knows who owns it. And people get a terrible flap about that. And we just did a case which is more or less like that, and the site was valued at £300 million, and they quite happily paid a premium just to cover this little access piece. And of course, it means a different approach to underwriting these risks, and it's created an image, because that's the sort of thing that, and that's the market that my company inherited when it came to the UK, because the good title market didn't exist. So to do business here, I had to go in and start doing business in the effective title area. And what that's done, and it's done some damage, I'd say, is create an image of our product in the eyes of the people who use it. Lawyers identify us with title insurance, and it's quite hard to get them to shift their attitude on these things. I might as well pay a token gesture to technology here. Right. The corporate structures, well, the typical US title insurer is what's called a monoline company. This all came out of disasters in the insurance industry a long time ago, when they weren't allowed to be so general anymore. They had to focus more on one line, and that predicates things like their reserving structure. So it's quite important that they don't transgress any of these rules. And most of its business will be in providing the guarantees that underpin the conveyancing process. Known risks that you find at the time you check the title may be excluded from cover. Much more of a performance to get cover for those over there. And of course, insurance over there is very heavily regulated. And it's not just by the government, it's regulated by the insurance industry itself, the American Land Titles Association. And the product has become, from what I can see, very standardised. It's very commoditised. It's very hard to distinguish what one company is offering from another. A UK title insurer will either be a subsidiary of a US